The guest pulled a photograph from his pocket. Johnny Carson stopped his monologue mid-sentence, signaled Doc to cut the music, and the studio froze. That photograph showed a face from Vietnam, the man who saved Johnny's life 15 years ago. It was March 1978. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B at NBC in Burbank. Another Tuesday night. Another packed audience expecting laughs, celebrity interviews, and Johnny's razor-sharp monologue about the week's headlines. Everything was routine. Everything was comfortable. Johnny was in the middle of a joke about President Carter when he noticed something unusual. The next guest wasn't a celebrity. The production assistant who handed Johnny the blue cue card had written in the margin, "Veteran. Special request. Says he knows you." Johnny glanced toward the wings where guests waited. A man in his late 40s stood there, wearing a simple button-down shirt and slacks. No stage makeup. No celebrity glow. Just a regular guy who looked nervous and kept touching his shirt pocket like he was checking for something. Johnny finished his monologue, the audience applauded, and Ed McMahon introduced the first guest, a comedian promoting a new album. Standard stuff. 20 minutes of jokes and banter. The audience loved it. During the commercial break, Johnny leaned over to Ed. "Who's the guy in the wings?" "The veteran?" Ed checked his notes. "Name's Thomas Hendricks. From San Diego. Producers said he wrote a letter to the show. Something about serving with you in the Navy." Johnny's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "I never talk about the Navy." "I know." But he was very insistent. Said it was important. The comedian left. Another commercial break. And then Ed's voice boomed across the studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Thomas Hendricks." Thomas walked onto the stage. The audience applauded politely. The way they did for non-celebrities, warm but curious. He shook Johnny's hand and sat in the guest chair, and Johnny could see his hands trembling. "Thomas, welcome to the show," Johnny said, sliding into his professional host voice. "I understand you're a Navy veteran?" "Yes, sir. USS Pennsylvania. 1962 to 1965. Johnny's entire body went still. His smile remained, but anyone who knew him well, Ed, Doc, the longtime crew members, could see something had shifted. "The Pennsylvania," Johnny repeated quietly. "Yes, sir. I was a corpsman. You probably don't remember me. There were hundreds of guys on that ship." Johnny was silent for a moment too long. The audience sensed it. The comfortable rhythm of the show had stumbled. "Thomas," Johnny said carefully, "why are you here tonight?" Thomas reached into his shirt pocket. "Because I've been carrying something for 15 years. And I think it's time you saw it again." He pulled out a photograph. Black and white. Worn at the edges. The kind of photo that had been folded and unfolded hundreds of times. He held it up. That night on The Tonight Show, a Vietnam photograph appeared on stage, and Johnny Carson stopped the show, told Ed to cut the music, because the man in that photo had saved his life 15 years ago. Johnny's face transformed. The host's mask vanished. What remained was raw recognition and something that looked like fear. He stood up from behind his desk. Something he rarely did during interviews unless it was for comedy. He walked around to Thomas, who was still holding the photograph. "Where did you get that?" Johnny's voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphones caught it perfectly. "You gave it to me, sir. August 1963. After the fire." The studio went completely silent. 300 people sensing they were witnessing something real. Johnny took the photograph from Thomas's hands. He stared at it for a long moment, and when he looked back up, his eyes were wet. "Ed," Johnny said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Tell Doc to stop any music. Tell the control room we're going off script." Ed McMahon, Johnny's friend for decades, nodded without question. The band went quiet. The producers in the control room frantically adjusted, but they kept cameras rolling. Johnny turned to the audience. Folks, I need to tell you something I've never talked about publicly. And I need you to understand why. He held up the photograph so camera one could see it. Two young men in Navy uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One of them was clearly a young Johnny Carson. The other was Thomas Hendricks, 15 years younger but unmistakable. This is from 1963, Johnny said. I was serving on the USS Pennsylvania in the Pacific. I was doing entertainment programming for the crew, comedy sketches, talent shows, that kind of thing. Trying to keep morale up. I thought I was pretty important. He paused, looking at Thomas. I wasn't important. I was a kid playing at show business while real men did real work. And one night, that almost killed me. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in August 1963, in the engine room of the USS Pennsylvania, somewhere in the South China Sea. Johnny Carson wasn't always Johnny Carson, king of late-night television. In 1963, he was Lieutenant John William Carson, United States Navy, assigned to entertainment duties aboard a destroyer escort. He'd been drafted during the Korean War, served his time, and by 1963 was counting down the months until his discharge. He was good at the entertainment work. He'd done comedy in college, worked in radio, even had a brief stint on television before the Navy called. He kept the crew laughing with his sketches and his impressions. He was popular. Safe. Not a combat role. Which is why nobody expected him to be in the engine room that night. Johnny had been visiting a friend, an engineer named Robert Chin, who'd asked him to come see the new equipment they'd installed. Johnny didn't understand half of what Robert was showing him, but he listened anyway because that's what friends did. They were standing near the boiler system when it happened. A valve failure. A burst of superheated steam. A spray of scalding water that filled the compartment in seconds. Robert went down immediately, his face and arms burned. Johnny felt the heat hit him, felt his skin burning, started to run for the hatch. And then someone tackled him. Corpsman Thomas Hendricks had been making his evening rounds, checking on the crew in different parts of the ship. He'd been 3 compartments away when he heard the alarm. He ran toward the engine room, saw the steam, saw 2 men inside, and made a decision that would define both their lives. He went in. Thomas grabbed Johnny first because Johnny was closest to the door, shoved him out of the steam, then went back for Robert. He dragged both men out of the compartment, his own hands and arms blistering from the heat, and immediately started treating their burns with supplies from his medical kit. Johnny's injuries were moderate, second-degree burns on his arms and neck. Painful but survivable. Robert's were worse. Without Thomas's immediate treatment, both men would have suffered permanent damage or worse. The Navy gave Thomas a commendation. His commanding officer praised his courage. The incident went into his service record. But what happened next stayed between Thomas and Johnny. 2 days later, Johnny was in the sick bay, his arms bandaged, recovering. Thomas came to check on him, routine medical follow-up. They talked for a few minutes about the incident, about recovery time, about nothing important. As Thomas was leaving, Johnny stopped him. "Hey, corpsman. Hendricks, right?" "Yes, sir. You saved my life in there. You know that, don't you?" Thomas shrugged. "Just doing my job, sir." "No," Johnny said firmly. "You ran into a steam-filled compartment when everyone else was running out. That's not protocol. That's heroism. And I want you to know, I'm going to remember this." Thomas smiled awkwardly. "You don't have to remember anything, sir. Like I said, just doing my job. I'm going to remember you," Johnny insisted. "And someday, when I'm out of this uniform and back doing what I'm supposed to be doing, I'm going to find a way to thank you properly." A week later, before Johnny was discharged from the sick bay, someone took a photograph of them together. Johnny's idea. He wanted documentation of the man who'd saved him. Thomas obliged, though he thought it was silly. They got copies of the photo. Johnny kept his in his wallet. Thomas kept his in his footlocker. 6 months later, Johnny's service ended. He went back to civilian life. Started working in television. Started climbing the ladder that would eventually lead to The Tonight Show. And he never contacted Thomas Hendricks again. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Not because he didn't want to. Not because he forgot. But because every time Johnny thought about that night in the engine room, he felt something he couldn't quite process. Shame? Guilt? Fear? He'd been the entertainment officer playing at military service while real sailors did dangerous work. And when danger found him, someone else had saved him. Someone braver. Someone better. Johnny buried that memory. He focused on his career. By 1962, he was hosting The Tonight Show. By the mid-1970s, he was the most famous television personality in America. And the photograph of him and Thomas Hendricks stayed in a drawer, untouched, a reminder of a debt he didn't know how to repay. Thomas Hendricks finished his Navy service, moved to San Diego, became a nurse, got married, had kids. He never forgot Johnny Carson. How could he? The guy was on television every night. But Thomas never reached out. What would he say? Hey, remember me? I saved you once? It seemed like bragging. So he stayed silent. Until March 1978, when Thomas's daughter came home from school with an assignment. Interview someone who did something heroic. She'd asked her father if he'd ever done anything brave. And Thomas had told her about the engine room, about saving 2 men from the steam, about one of them becoming the most famous host on television. His daughter's eyes had gone wide. You saved Johnny Carson's life? Dad, you have to tell him. You have to go on the show. Honey, it was 15 years ago. He won't even remember me. But his daughter was insistent. She made him write a letter to The Tonight Show. Just a simple explanation. Navy veteran, served with Johnny, wanted to say hello if Johnny remembered. 3 weeks later, the producers called. Johnny had seen the letter. He'd said yes immediately. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Now, standing on The Tonight Show stage in front of 300 people and millions at home, Johnny Carson held that photograph and finally spoke the words he'd been carrying for 15 years. Thomas saved my life, Johnny said simply. I was a lieutenant playing at military service. He was a corpsman doing the real work. And when that valve burst, he ran into danger while everyone else ran out. He saved me and another sailor. And I never thanked him properly. Johnny turned to Thomas, who was crying openly in the guest chair. I'm sorry it took 15 years. I didn't know how to face you. I didn't know how to acknowledge that someone else was braver than me when I was supposed to be the officer. Thomas stood up. Sir, you don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. Johnny extended his hand. Not for a handshake. He placed the photograph in Thomas's palm and closed the man's fingers around it. Thank you for my life. Everything I've done since that night. This show, this career, everything, exists because you ran into that engine room. The studio erupted. Standing ovation. The audience crying. Ed McMahon openly weeping. Doc Severinsen and the band playing softly as Johnny and Thomas embraced on stage. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, Johnny established a scholarship fund for the children of Navy corpsmen. He visited Thomas's family in San Diego every year until his retirement. The photograph stayed on Johnny's desk for the rest of his hosting career. When Johnny Carson died in 2005, Thomas Hendricks was invited to the private memorial. He brought the photograph. It's now in the Smithsonian, labeled, "The Debt That Was Finally Paid."